Teshe Dile. So I hope you all had a good rest and are ready to talk more. I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions and asking you to discuss things with your neighbors. So this morning you had a very broad overview of sensory systems. And we discussed how you have different receptors in your skin, your eyes, your nose, in your ears that help you collect information from the environment and process it in the brain. A really important aspect of learning science is to understand how we know what we know, how we collect information through our senses to understand the world around us and to understand our own brains. So I ask you, what do we call this process of generating hypotheses and testing them?
Scientific method.
Excellent. Good. So let's go to the next slide. Way to go. So now let's think about what is involved in the scientific method. This will be a review for you, I think. One of the first things that we do when we're investigating a scientific question is we use our senses. We use vision, we measure things. What is this called? What is this aspect of the scientific method called?
Observation.
Observation, right. So what are some other things that we do when we're using the scientific method to investigate a question we have? What is the next thing that you would want to have before you began a scientific experiment?
A question?
Exactly. You want to formulate a question. And you might have a general question that you want to ask, but the next step would be to come up with a testable hypothesis. So, for example, if you are studying a cell and you are asking questions about the function of a particular cell from your body, it could be a cell from the brain, a neuron, you would want to form a hypothesis that you could test using the scientific method. So for example, you learned this morning from the professor that you have receptors in your skin that respond to temperature or that respond to pressure.
Kanzo tandamone maiki shesuas di nganzo Losel na keje sho pasur na sho ekapso chiki thabong hashi ki khari yalin chigir la na chesigir la na chadu la yalin chesigir la roas anchi gi thanda neshu la yalin chesigir la roas.
If you want to understand how these sensory receptors in your skin function, you would need to generate a set of questions and testable hypotheses.
Ta di thanda wangso gi thanda nilem ba denzo da dewe ta kiranzo taje chiwu na di taje de dewe kiranzo gi chuba shabu roas.
So now, before we do an experiment, do we just simply go in and start poking or giving, trying various things, or do we actually think a little bit about what will happen if we do the experiment?
Ta kiranzo taje chiwu ri la di taje chel chuba sha chi roas taje che ndu ko la lamsa ta taje chi du tue da di tue ro khap do pheju che da khari na taje lamsa go chu gre yana di thola samlo tang gu res di taje di china khari yo nas lani di samlo tang gu yo res. Yes, we need to think about.
We want to make predictions about what will happen.
Ta khari chungu yo nas la jora ta taje di chi di ani ma zo on ba sha bu yo res di la.
So if going back to the example of the receptor cells in your skin, let's imagine that we have two different kinds of cells we can see. They look different. They have different forms or structure. We would predict that one kind of stimulus might cause one of those cells to respond but not the other.
Ta ara zo pa bona cha sha nas thabung ri ni la cha nas thoya yo mindra yin bai nas ti ta dini tawa cham gi ip tang namba da khari mal tawa na dini kheba du du wala ta ngo ju gi kuje chini kuje chte nas ra di kuje la ni thabung khandi gi yalen chi du chi gi yalen chi o che chi gi ma yalen ma chi wa di ngo ju di thabung ni di yewa yo bai nas kheba yo bai nas ti ni na.
So we could design an experiment to test that. We could provide different types of stimuli for the different receptors, maybe a hot stimulus, a cold stimulus, a painful stimulus, for example.
Chezan ta nelin thabung jura digal maran so kuje dam de tang ni ta che chi cho ras yana ni shu do ne digi ta kuje dam de te ras ni shu te re yana chadu chawo yin chala chawo de shane shares yana su ma di che jura chugu gin chin de che ras ta che du.
And we would predict that those three different stimuli would have different effects on the receptor cells. The cell might respond only to one, but not the other two.
Dila de ta thabung sum yo ai nasra anga ju ku yen de ju tang do gala ku yen sum de ta na thabung chigla yalen chio chi chigi yalen chio chi shimba ni di yale ma chio inde yong sig roas.
So now you're thinking like scientists. What would be the next step in your experiment?
Ta kheran zo seri bana shi samlo tang yo roas ta digi jela ni rimba khari chagi yo res ta chi du mon ba shay ba digi jela khari che ta chi. So after prediction we will experiment namsha a theory.
Well, you have a hypothesis, you make predictions, you now need to collect data.
Ta kheran zo di sha sa ras mon ba di sha sa ras amunya la ngo chusha di chi sa ras ra di jela mon ba ya sha sa ras ta ngo zo khari gu gu la na chang do gu gu ras.
So for the example of the receptors in your skin, what kinds of data would you be able to collect?
Ta tang chi cha sha de na ngo zo khari sha la na pa be gan di cha sha ras pa be ni le ba ta di la du ga la ngo zo chang do khande ji du res di la.
Any ideas?
Khande ji chi du res ta ji na ta ji khande ji chi gu res la. Khari samse pape gala khari Samsu durup chiya. Mi mangbo gala. The michik la mai bachi mi mangbo la chini lara. Nichika. Le kujem drama da shine. So he said we can collect the data by experimenting, like we can take different stimulus and see what the effect is on that particular skin area.
Okay. And so, good, that's right. How do you have some ideas of how you might measure or collect data from a cell in your skin?
Ta thanda di kherang ge indi chiya yore la ra taji di la du ta ding azu taji ma thangdo la ma pam gi was thangdo di ta thabong ni thangdo ji du bu ras di thangdo khandes tu thu res la Chapa chi jo di thanda taji ki jo thing du da 장도 듀라 딱지 지도가 그 장도 한데스 두개 나 딱지 지도가 땅 아주 장도 지요 이 장도 한데스 두개 나 어디 딱지나 장도 디 카릴 시산 두기 나오 칸데스 두기 나오 담미다 망고 내라 카리 길래 다 장도 디 인데스나 디거스 투레 세제 조라 카릴 지기 나오 장도 라두가 직 땡고 요라 안기 도지 디 엔 칸데스 땡기 인 나오다 세지도 준비 요라 나 뉴즈가 세지도 준비 요라 준비 다 찾는 거 하시지 요라 또 그래 녀스래죠
잠지 지거라.
준비 와라.
자디 dumje alyo
니게 비웠던 땡기 차상 지게 집어 차상하나 그 준비 있다고 전에 세시가 더 나와라. 디기터는
어디 dumje di khandira relo dumje di khandesli ta thangdo la mappa baina khandes
다 영희 치크는 케르마스가 다이나 쓰라. 영희 치크는 니 케르마스가 티 코케마스가 티 코케마.
karma karma
나키 케르마 와라. 영희 케르마 티아이나 쓰라. 니 통화티 그 통화티 라냐 소아이나. 그디 이 차타 방도 치치거래.
tadi karma ro thanda di takje nang la khandes duge law so he's giving examples. We can collect data, like when I look at that star, the other person looks at the same star, and we can collect data. I said she's asking about the particular this experiment.
Yeah, it's a hard question. So let me give you some more information. See if you can solve this question. So you learned this morning that when a stimulus like pressure or temperature reaches your skin, you have receptors that respond to that stimulus. That's a physical stimulus. The receptor in your skin that are very specific for heat or cold will respond. What do those cells do when they respond to the stimulus? What changes? What is the signal?
That this limbe jawas ane chudi that handa shuge shirwas onjo chi kujin jitte oinas di papa dil cha shawana di nalo nelim ba yorwas ne thabu digi ani yalin chigyor la rwas di yalin chigyor na ta nishu la yalin chigyor badra yana chawla chigyor na re thamul chigyor na yalin chigyor nas ta da jitti rwas da di khari res di tadun chig chinge jyor wa la ta dil tadun di khari res Ta kheron sorgida yora dadun khari chi yore lawar Tadun chigin kharicha ta chau resha la wa na khandis la ju re la. So he said like when the particular cell is responding to that stimulus, the cell moves. So by that we can say that the cell is responding to that stimulus.
So the cell changes its, it has a signal that it sends. It's a neuron. It's a type of neuron.
Tanda di tanda dajik tigur la was that tingi tabung chigwas tabung dikarlan tanda onza tasu chadu was.
Okay, so what is the way that neurons communicate with other neurons?
Ta tanda onza tasu chig da onza tasu shen para dewa was di khandes dewa chigur res. Khari unit zeda through chemical signals.
Exactly, yes. Okay, so when the cell responds to the stimulus, its electrical properties change, it releases neurotransmitter onto the next cell.
Dilla dutta digala kijol yuash droros di yuala tene ani tanda dina lokda joros dina gyodu ros dige ani nganzo zedi tanda wangza timba di luros di yuala tene.
And that's something that you could measure in an experiment. You could put an electrode into the cell and measure its change in electrical potential with the different stimuli.
Dilla dutta nganzo dilla yuar drodu thambo chi ku yen la tene yalin chigena yuash dure la ra di yuala tene wangza timba lures la ra wangza timba lujo jora di nganzo ini cheje ros kagas lugu medi di en nganzo khandes chetur lana lone karay ros dela lone suni shawina wangza timba kagas lugu medi logi danal nganzo logi nuba jora dina tay ros manglo kagas lugu medi.
So in this example of a cell in the skin that's responding to pressure, heat, or painful stimulus, we could record from the cell while we're providing different types of stimuli.
Dilla duta yale chigidu chigumdu tay jora di ngara zo thogo che ros tay kujen dittewana di yale chigidu lani ya kujen mendo jishawana yale chigidu chigumdu la di ngara zo thogo chini ta cho ros di onza tanda onza timbablu malu di ke shiwara.
And in this way, we could collect data that would tell us what types of stimuli will specifically excite that receptor cell and cause it to release transmitter.
Di thogo ta ngazo ragu ros ta jishini di latte ne ngazo shisha ni la thu ros kujen dinde jitte oina anelen thagung di ani kuma the duslani dinde shetu ros ta ji di yuni.
So let's imagine we do this experiment and we collect data about the different types of stimuli and we record the cell's activity. After we collect the data, what is the next step in the scientific method?
Ta kujen kharigi nilem thabung dila kuma the dulai jora yalen chi thu dulai di en ngazo thangto di du sa jala di jala ni rimba khari li res ngazo khari chi bu res thangto du dire la ra thangto du sa ra di jala an khari chi bu res la khari che social okay. Social dida tungu ta ores. Social dida tungu ta ores ra. So now we have to see whether it is in accordance with the hypothesis or not.
That's right. So we would analyze the data, and in the process of analyzing the data, we might collect a lot of data from many different cells.
Di la dutta ngazo thangdo thanda digyo jiros di cheship chigros di chiwor la dugala thangdo di thabung mangbu shiu ni lengu guros thangdo mangbu chgu guros dila.
And only after that could we really draw conclusions about whether our hypothesis was correct.
Tadi thangdo mangbu yese jala an ngazo chukdom di chichuro chithuros thanda ngazo chesha chigyo di tada re dure medulani.
Okay, so these steps are summarized in the next slide.
Tatanda korim rodang jido di changma thanda slide jema dina li res.
So we just went through all of this. So the scientific method involves observation,
Tadi nganzo dos hares seri gi thablam dirwas dinan khare khare sugurla na shipta yorwas.
we then formulate a question that we want to test.
Di jel ngaranzo chuda tagje khare chi gugo na dila thiwaji kri yorwas.
And we make a hypothesis.
Di jel an chubaji shay yorwas nganzo.
That hypothesis leads us to make predictions about what we will find when we do the experiment.
Ta chuba chi sa je la ni kesi tagje di chiwa na nganzo khari ni gre la jora di ani moba shay yorwas.
And then when we do the experiment, we not only test the hypothesis, but we also test whether our predictions were correct.
Ta ga nganzo tagje di chi yorwas tagje di chi du chuba shagyo de chi pu ta re de chi pu teng mare chuba shagyo da moba ni ga ta di des ta yores tagje dina.
In science, once we've collected the data and analyzed the results and formed conclusions, we convey this information to other scientists, and they review the scientific experiments. This is called peer review.
Dila dita thanda tagje chi sa jela an jugdom ge res la ra. Ani jugdom gya sa jela an tagje di nganzo thanda cheri ba symbol di chi res ma tagje chi shagyo di ma tam ge res an khoran chu ge ya kyar to nang res tagje di. Dila an nganzo peer review la ge res.
So often students get confused about the difference between hypothesis and predictions.
Ta lok tu mang cha khari la go thu yor la wa nas thanda nganzo cheba dida ngom ba dingil thu yor res.
In general, a hypothesis is a statement about a mechanism, how something works.
Ta thanda cheba la na khande ji la yor la wa na khande ji im ba na di la ga hande chi re cherim khari re gyurim khari re la jora di gyurim di korshi yor res cheba dina la.
But on the other hand, a prediction is if I do something, then this will happen. So if I stimulate the cell with a hot stimulus, then the cell will fire or not fire. So it's an if-then. A prediction is based on what you believe the outcome will be.
Ta thanda ngomba la dil khari yor la wa na khatu na khari lir la na kesi nge di chi wa na di chung res la jora kesi da chung wa la di ni li yor res. Thanda be sha wa na ngazo pakwa dina cha sha ras kesi nge chawo ji thanda thu ba na pakwa la ku je di le sti wa na ani nge nang lo thanda ongza thabung de ku ma the ni yogu chi re ani thanda le jum ni ba di ke chung re la jora di li yor res kesi da di chung la di ngomba na chu yor res.
So it's only after we do the experiment that we can go back and ask whether our original hypothesis was correct or not.
Ta tanda tagje di che sa je la ngazo ngola thangbo go chu de cheba ngoma shagyo jora di takta re dur takta di du di ta ge res.
And often scientists, as you can see in this picture of the Dalai Lama and monks, use different scientific instruments to measure and observe.
Dila du ta cheri ge thablam nam thanda dina la khonso choda ani ngindu bandu ju dos dina ta wa na par dina khari ur la wa na dina la thuje ri yoje din ju riks dos di gyuni ngajo ge khari thong gu me da ta da cheje da din ju di gyuni chi ur was.
So it's only through using various kinds of scientific instrumentation and methods that we can really test hypotheses in science using the scientific method.
Chezan cheba di ta di du ta jora di cheri ge thablam na la ngajo cheri ge yoje di ge phejo chini cheba di ta re du re mi du ta thu ur res.
Next slide. So what is the value of asking questions in science? We want to really understand why it is so important that we ask questions in science.
Ta cheri na thiwa ta jorwas di khajin khechum bu chagyo res lan di jik thiwa chagyo res thiwa di khechum khajin chagyo res lan thiwa ta di.
By asking questions, we can narrow the scope of our scientific investigation.
Dila du thiwa khabas ki manga ta na digas ki ngazo cheship che di ma thong nyung du ras chik na du ras
by making predictions that test our hypothesis, we are also able to make the scientific experiments very directed and focused.
Dila du nga zo choba shagyo dila ngomba ji shawainas an thanda digi thanda taji che di lamcho do laura di tungi ji chadi go ras ngomba di shawainas.
Some questions can be tested by experiments, the way we've been talking.
An taji khashi ngara zo yuche den zo pheju chini ani taji chi thu yo ras.
But there are other questions that are very interesting, but we may not have a precise scientific method for answering those questions.
Dila du thiwa khashi yapu yor te hine manzo di cheri gi thabla na ma chu be ta le gya ma thu ya den de khashi kangi thi yo ras. Thiwa yapu khashi indel ha di yo res.
For example, in neuroscience, ultimately we're interested in understanding the nature of what is consciousness.
Tat pe shawaina nga zo thanda wangza cheri na la thiwa chi khare li yo lawaina thanda sheba la di rangshi khare la jura di li yo res thiwa di.
But we don't have the tools to directly test the nature of consciousness.
Cheza ta digi rangshi khanje jur la du wala ta di tawje che jura di ngajo dangi yo mares.
And so for many, many years in the field of neuroscience, we have investigated simpler questions. How do we see? How do we hear? How do we feel?
Cheza ta thiwa tab de dinde rigal ma phawi res. Di la du ngajo khandes thongi yo res, khandes thugi yo res la jura khandes chorgi yo res la di sama thiwa di ligi yo res.
So it's very important in scientific inquiry to narrow the scope of the questions you are asking.
Dila do ta cheri na la chik cheri thamum na khari chugur la na thize de zo ma duni chik suya jura di khechum pucha yo res thiwa ta de zo.
So in this slide you see the Himalaya mountains, and we could ask the question, what forces created these mountains?
Ta tanda this slide na la khera zo thungu das Himalaya regu par di res. Ta di ri den zo khandes chawa res lan thiwa li ras. Shu khari latte ni chawa res la jura di thiwa di chai ras.
And you may know that the Himalayan mountains are getting taller and taller.
An khera zo ha gu gu res lodar khari chigur la na digi toje jura ya toro du yo ras ri di.
This is not a process we can observe with our eyes, right?
Di gurim di ngaro zo mig rangi thoya yo gurim di chad yo ras.
So how do we know that the mountains are getting taller every year? What scientific method would be used to find that out?
Ali tanda migi thegar thoya ta ngajo toje toro du du lai di she khakpu chabi yo ras. An di ani ngajo che je gu ras di khandes che tu res cheri gi thablam ni she wainas.
And also, you might ask, what force is creating this uplift of the Himalayan mountains?
Thanaji toje phare jora di ani di phare la shu khari gi kenchini phargi ore la di theologically ras.
And so geologists have a theory that what is causing it are plates in the earth that are sliding across each other, creating the mountains.
Sashi ribo do Quran zo khari shigor la namsha shasha gores dina khari shigor la nasana la sai le mu chimbu ri jora plate denzo chiga chig indation twini ani ridia thoro duwer lan shigores.
So that's a hypothesis about how the Himalayan mountains are formed, but it's not a hypothesis that we can directly test.
Dila do ta di choba shasha gores ra thanda di salib denzo ya twini ani ya ridi chagores lan shevas.
So I'm using this example as a very interesting question, but one that is very difficult to test. Are there any questions about what we've talked about so far?
La. So he wants to know more about hypothesis and prediction.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about hypothesis next.
Ta digi jala nganzo chosha gala ni dre is.
So when I make a hypothesis in my laboratory, I'm making a guess or an explanation of what I think is happening.
Ta tanda ngara tagje khana cha shawenas ani tagje chidu gala ngi ta di khari chungure sambai samjo juras di gala an soba ji shagruas.
If we're doing an experiment to test our hypothesis, we don't have all the information we need. We need to do additional research to test that hypothesis.
Ta tanda soba shagyo dinala nesu dangwa ji yoro lana yo mares di gala nganzo nembe en tagje chigu ras dila.
So in the case of the question we posed, what force created the Himalayan mountains? There are lots of different ways to investigate this question, and many different approaches could be used.
Dila dita thandangula Himalaya ri di khandes char la jora di tiwo di imbainas dila ani ngansu kita thablam do laura tinde shizu minda mangbush li ras dila.
So for example, Abhidharma, the scholarly study of Buddha's teachings, would be one approach that has a history of being used to study things in the world.
Ta tanda chun nang la chik sheswa digi khari shi wor lana tanda ngansu gi say khule lo yu din nang la khandes chai me di and di guni chik che ras.
And a very different approach is the scientific method, where we use instruments to measure phenomena.
An thablam chik khari chadur lana cheri gi thablam chade ras dinal ngansu cheri gi tuje da yuje din zo pheju chine ani tagje chi res.
So there are different ways that different cultures have come up with to test things and formulate hypotheses. And we're really focusing today on the scientific method.
Ta dila du tagje chia da namsha dube jura di ani rishung ta na loga chade res.
So I want to now talk about hypotheses in more detail.
Tanda ngaron zo khari gal share lo na cheri gi thablam ba shi res ra ani tanda manga khari gal shi na tanda chusha gal dremis.
What is so in the scientific method, can a hypothesis be any proposed explanation, or are there specific things that limit or a valid hypothesis in science?
Dila du tanda dina la khari sugur lo na the first one was,
is any question or any hypothesis valid, or are there specific types of hypotheses that we can test using the scientific method?
ta cheri gi thablam beju shini ta tanda chusha chigran ju tagda digure ya na dila manga yo sigir la di chik chagi ros.
And so, of course, I want you to be thinking now about what makes a good hypothesis.
Dila du da chusha ya pu chik khandi jil lagir la di gan tu is.
What do you think?
Ta chusha ya pu la na khandi ji gu res kiran ju samju khari res. Khari Mobu digne dang. So when you hypothesize something and when you get the result in accordance with the hypothesis, you say that's a good hypothesis.
Okay, good. So the hypothesis has to be something that we can test.
Ta chi khari lawor lana choba lana khandi ji gugur lana marazo ta chi chetu bachi dendi ji gugur ras.
And generally that means it has to be something that we can do an experiment and measure outcomes of the experiment.
The choda shautu asla tanda da choba jura choda chetu yo dendi ji gugur res so sha ya pulana dila du nganzo khari chugur lana dinala ta ji chetu yo dendi che chetu yo dendi gugur ras.
So in science, we often do what we call a thought experiment.
Ta nganzo chering na la chi khari yang khari chigur launa samlo tagje lai di chigur res.
And in that thought experiment, we formulate a hypothesis, we make predictions, and we guess or make predictions about what we will see.
Ta samlo tagje na khari chigur launa tanda chosha che jura soba shaya di chugures an thang na chi dinde chiona di chugures la ni mo ba shaya jura di samlo tagje na chugures.
But it's very important to actually do the experiment and make measurements to test your hypothesis.
이내 단나가서 초바 샤교디 딱다레도 레미도 때라 거리 개충부 차교라나 알아서 딱지 체제를 제조를 디상마 개충부 차교레스.
Right. So basically I'm saying that because a hypothesis is a conjecture, it must be tested. It's a best guess about something that you observe in the world around you.
디다 최샤라이디 컨디를 라와나 가족이 딱지 치에다 알아서 최샤 야쇼 초바 야쇼 샤투교 주라 딩아라 주랑중 칸나 통해요 디가 딱지 치에 디차도요 라스 최샤라나.
So in the example that we just heard, if your data support your hypothesis, you're happy.
다 쿠란소니 니셔나 시레스 단자 케란조에 딱지 친 장도지라고 라스 계시 디다 초바 샤교디 튜바이나스 안 케란 기보용으로 라스 가로 라스.
But also a good hypothesis must be one that can be falsifiable. That is, we must be able to discover an outcome of an experiment that would conflict with that hypothesis.
제가 최샤라나 지 가리 보고 일라나 투바 두룽이 바지 고고 이레스. 당저 최바 샤교들 투바 임바지 뚠퇴 딘데 인조 최바지 고고 이레스.
So in this way we rigorously test a hypothesis by designing experiments that can support it or disprove it.
제가 아니 가서다 최바 샤교딜라 딱지 드라미데 망부지 치기레스. 딜라타니 딱 양면나 가리 두르라나 탑니 차그로스. 야나 딜라 디람데 치니지 차디그레스. 야나 딜 따다 마임바 잉에 뚱그로스.
Okay, next slide. So remember that we said that when you're testing your hypothesis, you should be asking a question that has a very focused question, so that limits the scope of what you're going to test.
제가 최다 샤도갈라 키란조 모닝은 조 셰차레스 디카르라나 티와지라 티와디게 아니 상마냠도 뒤에지 말아주기 되는 찍라테요 티와디디 디두고 요로스.
So in the example of what causes the Himalayan mountains to form, the kinds of inquiry that you would do would involve the mountains, the Himalayan mountains in particular, not other mountains.
다단다 티와지 카리차도르라나 저 히말라야 리규디 칸데스 차레라주라 디 티와디 차샤웨나 디나나 티제나라치 카리추르라나 저 히말라야 리규디 랑추 히말라야 디 추르라스 리셴바 추마레스.
You might also take samples of the rocks at different places in the mountains.
아니 단다 리가랑 저도 장도 망부시니 요라스 딘조 아니 레니 딱제 치엘라 링그로스 딘조 디그로스 도 딘조.
If you found evidence of a kind of rock that's only present after a volcanic eruption, it would disprove your hypothesis that it's caused by shifting of plates of the earth.
다단다 도디 두그로스 딱제 시도갈라 두두발라타 계시 도디 칸데지니 오이나스 메리추니 도디 차교를 샬라이조라 딘데 로지니 오이나 안 단당모니 키란조 초바 카리샤르라나 단다 레모사이 레모딘조 딩니 차교를 라이디 소샤디 딱다 데마소스.
Okay? So, did you move it one more? Yeah, okay. So another point that I want to make is that it must be possible, when you formulate a hypothesis, it must be possible to actually observe and measure objectively.
딜라데다 초바지 샤도 마라조 랑기 단다다 율라타네 간조기 체제다 디상마 아니 케중부 차교로스.
So that means when we take a sample of the rocks, it will be possible for any person to analyze that rock sample and come to the same conclusion about the kind of rock that is contained.
단다 마라조로 차샤와나 다지 유디 카르차들라나 단다 도디 차도로스 디 소소랑 마임바 체리바심바 미수 레와이나이스 코랑기 디 도디갈 다지 체투에요 덴디스쿠부로스.
And so this is why in science, scientists report their findings in scientific publications so that another scientist can then go and repeat the experiment and validate it.
제가 안 체리바 코란소에 카리니에 샤오디 상마 체리 코랑기 빠림 체주라 딘데나 당시기 res di tang sadu gala ni tan sarni tan doran jo sarni chungyo di lodu gala cheri ba shamba di kyar do ni tagje di chigi res chitub gi res.
Okay, next slide. So not every hypothesis can be a scientific hypothesis, and we need to have hypotheses that have certain qualities.
Dila du tsosha khande jing ba na cheri gi tsosha rela na di mares khaina nga ranjo thanda taji che thue yo che je thue yo de lech ku go ros.
So just to summarize, the hypothesis is something that after testing, it might be possible to find evidence that conflicts with the hypothesis.
Dila du ta tsosha la na khande ji gu go la na cheri gi ta taji nangjo choda che thue yo che an di nye wa na thanda tsosha di da ge de yong se yo de tsosha ji gu go res.
If we find a lot of volcanic rock in the Himalayan mountains, it would contradict our hypothesis that the mountains are caused by plates shifting in the earth, not by volcanic activity.
Ngoni shio na shira tanda nganjo tsosha khari sha la na tanda Himalaya rigudi sale modin ju jani ya le thoro do jo res lan she ras ta tanda nganjo do ta che cheo kapso kisi do di meri chuni tanda chungsha ge do ji bainas nganjo ni tsosha di da ge do as.
And also, a scientific hypothesis should be one that we can test in a way that's through observation and measurable phenomena.
Ani tseri gi ta tsoda la na khali ji gu gu la wa na nganjo gi che je yo a che an tinde ri ji gu gu res chuni de.
Perhaps if we could travel back in time and lived for many, many centuries, we could observe the formation of the Himalayan mountains, but that isn't possible.
Ta kesa nganjo thuzul ma dro chida che yo enasra lo tongda mambu ma dro ena ta Himalaya di khande chai me nganjo thong ros ne di chitu yo maros.
So it's very important to have empirical evidence or data in order to test hypotheses.
Dila du ta ngaran su rang ge shita chini thanda thangdo duye jura di gu gu ros cheshala ram dek chingi.
So now let's turn to the second necessary part of the scientific method, predictions.
Ta thanda cheri gi thablam na la chi khari chudio la na ngomba di chugi ros.
And a prediction is as I said before, it's a statement about if my hypothesis is correct, then what would be the logical consequence of that hypothesis?
Ta thanda ngomba la ni ni sho na shires di khari lawor la na khesi ngi chosha di tawda di yo ainas di gi dumde khari yong sigre la jura di chabi res.
If we have if two or more hypotheses can make the same prediction, then we don't have enough evidence. We need to have more evidence in order to distinguish between those hypotheses.
Ta kesi chosha ni yo ainas ra di la ngomba chi yo ainas nganjo di la choda mangbu ji chi gu gu ros di ni yo chela.
So often in science we can make predictions that have nothing to do with the experiment that we're actually using to test our hypothesis.
Kashe chosha chi dong jo tagje chi chi yo ros di da di ni de me yo ro cha di yo res chosha di da tagje ni de.
So it's important to make predictions that are not simply due to chance or coincidence.
Cheza ngomba la di susu rang gi ta khari she de di yungre sam ne chik she jora di rang mai ba che di ni para chosha da tagje para de gu gu res.
So let's talk about predictions a little bit more. We could do some research on the effects of meditation, for example.
Ta pesen ro sha wa nas anganju gi thanda gom nyamlen chine ani di gi shugen khari yo res la ne di ga she wa nas.
So we might be interested in the question of whether meditation affects the process of attention.
Ta chi khari chuo lir la na gom nyamlen chi wa nas an di gi nganju gi thanda thunang che jora ila che balade di la ni shugen ti gi res la ni thiwa chi li ros.
And we would formulate the hypothesis that shamatha meditation improves focused attention.
Ani tak ngomba ji sha wa nas ni gom nyamlen chi wa na thanda ila che ba jora den ne chi la thunang che tu di yarge tang res la khongbel tong res la ni shi res.
So we might then design an experiment to test this in long-term meditators.
di ani ngazo taje chi ras an taje chi sa khol chi lana gom nyamle mangbu shu chi ta gyuring bu chi thunge dinde chi taje chi res.
And we would predict that someone who has meditated for many, many years, practiced meditation, would have longer attention span.
Ta taje chi du gala Quran zu ngazo gomba harisha lana lo mangbu shu ji thanda gom nyamle chi na Quran zu yila chebale thunang chi thwe di gyuring chi thu res lani shi ras.
And we could also make the prediction that someone who is meditating regularly might show an improvement over time in their attention span and concentration.
An thana shi chi gomba hari chi tur lawana khagas ki gyuring bu ngazo gi thanda gom nyamle chi waina di shuking di khari tir lawana thunang che di yarge khumbe du res la jura di shi ras mo ba chi res.
So what do you think? What prediction would you make in this particular example if the hypothesis is that meditation improves attention span? And I asked a group of monks who were beginning meditators or long-term meditators to memorize a page of text.
Ta kiranzula tiwa chi yes di kharla na thanda yila cheba le jura di ani thanda gom nyamle chiwa ni yage khumbe du res lan ta soba mo ba chi ras an kisi taje chiwa na ta gindu ba khashi ji len che taje chela khashe kharla na gom nyamle gochu sa sin yo de sawa imba che khashe gom nyamle chi ni gyuring bu shu sto nas nga khari ni res de taje chiwa nas ta truga ni cha so di da duro na khari ngu res la gyuring bu nyamle chi di Tenang diya to Ruslan. So we will find that the long-term meditators will have more attention span.
And if we make that prediction, should we also test the effect of the age of the individuals?
So that chiras di chidugal anganzo di lengua chagyo res that kom yangi jura Quran sugi lose jura di lengua kechum chagyo res. Lo khazu imedi. Kechum mare? No.
No. Not important. So if the individuals who have meditated the longest are 100 years old,
then kom nyamle chishu during shodo chasha na Quran lo ya imbai nas.
Would their attention span be longer than someone who was 50 years old who would?
Ta Quran ni dudugala chik lo yara chik lo ngam chu imbai nas. Quran ni dudugala lo ya injo digi thana thunan che thuju ringa nyatu yores. Quran ni du chik lo ya chik ngam chu ra.
Same number of years meditating.
Supu ikarila nido khachire nido la raw ligres. Nido la raw ligre. So the strength of the person does not affect on the attention span.
So we would probably want to make sure that the number of years practicing meditation was the only important variable that we were measuring.
Chezan tanda manjugi ta keche shu ta jora chege je di khari chadur launa gyuring le gom nyamle chi shadi chabi roas.
Do each of you have the same attention span?
Kiran zu changma tunang che gi tuju jora tuye di chibar roesa changma tunang che tuye jora da mobu chigla tunang chi launa tuju chik chabi ore changma chibar roesa. No.
So there are individual differences also that we have to make sure that we control for in a scientific experiment.
Chezan mire ngore la khabar roas andi changma anju taji chidu wala khejumbu chigi ores.
So if we were to test the hypothesis that the number of years of meditation, the longer you meditate, the better you are at focusing, then we also need to control for many other variables, individual differences, for example.
Tatana ngazo kharit chejer lawaina kom khagas ki yuring le gyawaina digas ki thana ngazo cho di thana kharit tagur lawaina thana di thuring le chitu dos la di tagur was Dilla duga le ne de shemba gi kechumbu chagi yorwas. Tanda cha shawana chi kharile de lawana mire ngori khebar de yorwas.
So if we were doing this experiment and you had stayed up all night studying for a test before I tested your attention span, would that affect the performance on in the experiment?
So what was that?
If I tested you after you had stayed up all night, and then I tested your attention span, would that make a difference?
Ya tiwa chi gyes ta te kharla na tanda tagche che jura Quran zul ta kiran zu cha sha sa kiran zul tanda ngonzu gi tanda tagche ma chi kong la chen chi gyura kiran zu che ma nyo inas ani shoge di undu tagche chi yo ina dile kheba sur yes tagche dila.
Yeah. So we have to control for age, number of years meditating, sleep, maybe whether you had a meal.
Ta di changma kechumbu chagi yorwas tanda tagche dinala tangjin chi we chi khar chagi lana mire ngori gi kheba yorwas thana shi ani ni khagas ra me jora di ra li yorwas thana shi lo di changma ani lok mangyung gi tanda kom khagas kya me lo jora di changma tangjin chi we chagi yorwas kechumbu chagi yorwas tangje na.
So those are all physical factors that could affect the outcome of our experiment.
Di changma ta chi chagi lo ji chagi yorwas ma jo tagje dila shugen tinge digiri di.
What about some other things that you, in your daily training here at the monastery, what are some other things that might improve your attention span? What about memorizing texts?
The Kiranzo Tanda Yila Cheba Tuzu Jura Tuindi, Yargi Tailani, Tanda Nindargi Chego Yora Gombenala, Dinal Kiranzo Karikari Tsures, the Kiranzo di Tanda Peja Lunzi Chejuras.
Yeah, that's likely. What about attending classes, scholarly classes?
Zinda Tsoya Jura, Zinda Lato Chahedi.
That could improve your attention span. What about debating?
Ani Tanda Tasitaya Juras di.
Does that improve your attention span?
Di Ani Tanda Yila Cheba Tuindi, Yargi Tangarues. La. Did I Imbara? I said, of course, he does say yes.
What about making sand mandalas?
Mandal Suyo on the Chemegi. This Sudu Galasa. Di Yargi Tangarues, on the Yila Chebe Tuindi. Tangre, Tangsibares. It may improve.
So all of these are factors that could improve attention span and concentration.
Sesamata Tanda Manso Ila Chebegi Tanda Tuindi Yargeta Keji Shiuras, that the get some way Tanda Yargeta Chagin Chaduras.
So coming back to our original hypothesis that meditation improves attention span and that someone who meditates for more years will have a longer attention span, we can see that there are many other factors that could also be important for improving attention span.
Chesam Tanda Muni Tsosha Harisha Lona, Tanda Yila Chebe Tuin Juradi, Mazu Gom Yamlin Chuana, Yargitangri Laros, the Tanda Gom Yamlin Chibu Mai, but Tanda Marosu Chagi Mambuji Shembas, Diget and the Shugin Tigiros.
So you can turn to the next page in your handout while we're working on the slides. So if we find an improvement in attention, basically how can we conclude that shamatha meditation was the cause and not these other explanations?
Dila ani digi kengi res lan khandes la thu res la khare tembu do mindu tere whether he has a stable memory or not we can check
if they
has a strong and stable memory or not we can check that
but how do we know that all the other practices are not also improving attention span? How do we know it's the meditation and not the other things like debating or reading texts or going to classes?
Chesanta tanda mi dila ila chebi tui di yarke tosha lagi ro dila duwa tanda di manzo gom nyamlen chue di rangi re ani shimba tanda manzo tsobat chue da ani tanda pechalonji che da tenzu kingi mari la manzo yaw handis che thures di khandil la thures la So we can take a long-term meditator and a new meditator, so we can compare.
Yes. So I'm trying to make the point that we might want to have somebody practicing a different type of meditation while also doing all the same types of other work that they do, other scholarly work that they do.
Tadanda nganzu gom nyamlen di shamata ga rias lang sheso di en tanda di mai bayang gom nyamle gom shimba yorwas rik gom shimba yangi rik shimba yangi rik jora dinzo ani khozu nyim bara dure yorwas.
So what we try to do in the scientific method is only change one variable, one thing at a time, to make sure that we are testing our hypothesis.
Dile du tanda nganzu dina chashawana juwa dre chik latani nganzu yewa cherwas. Dila dugal tseri ki tanda tablam nala dile ro chiyo res tangje chi dugala. Juwa dre yurang di chik juwa tangyo res.
Okay, next slide. So now I would like you to work in small groups to test your hypothesis, to design a better experiment that shamatha meditation improves focused attention. We just discussed many of the variables that could affect it. So perhaps you can work, the two people on either side of the aisle can confer, and then you can work in pairs, spend a few minutes thinking about how you would test the hypothesis that shamatha meditation improves attention span, and then we'll report back.
Andi khalan tanda shine gom jiwa ding nyamne chiwa tanda yila chebi tuyun di ya yarge kongbel tangi yores le jura digal an keran zu chosha yabuji sha tyana shi taji khari chi di chodur na ro chis. So in groups of two
just take 5 minutes, 3 minutes to think about this, and then we'll report back.
Ta tanda di ruga chunji le do mi ni nyam do yisra ani ni sum do khaju ina ta sum le ma mesa andi kama sum kama ngas doji kiran zo chodurna di jalan kiran zo khari suba khari shayang di ashiya is.
And if somebody's behind, they can work with the people in front.
Ani di gap le yo kiran zo ni nyam da na dire di ni nyam da na dire kiran chi puri dan kiran ni nyam da na nas.
So you can discuss amongst yourselves.
Kiran zo na lo chodur na lo chesa da kama sum kama ngas yus dila.
So I'm very interested in hearing some of your brilliant ideas.
Ta kiran sugi samsu kechimbu laura da ya bu shu inde ki gire sambu dosti konde dos.
So we'll be passing the microphone around just to maybe 4 or 5 different groups to hear from you. And then I want to talk about how we actually graph data.
Ruga shingani ani samsu due is andi ruga rere na matang du kiran zo di phejo chiro chis mic de ra ani kiran zo samsu di jo di zo theoretical ko is.
So which group would like to share with the rest of the class their idea for the experiment to test whether long-term meditation, shamatha meditation, improves attention span?
Ta tanda zo ta che di shirwas tanda shine gol di kengi ni tanda yila chebi tuyun di ya kongbel tang dos la di andi gal kiran so chosha da ani taje khari yus khandi ruga khandi belen yangi khandi 라. 거리는 조금 지그래? 아니 또 단다 그런 소 딱지도 네 말을 팔 지어라. So this is not their idea or something like about a hypothesis or experiment, but here's a question. So in Buddhism we talk about two types of meditation. So one is single-pointed meditation, and the other one is analytical meditation. So when you talk about kyangi gomna na khande jila tigi yesra, didala sai. Gomna na khande jila munji tigi yesra. So as a scientist, what do you consider something as meditation? What do you mean by meditation?
Well, if you're interested in Buddhist meditation, and there are different types of meditation that you practice, you can design an experiment to test the two different types of meditation. So there are many ways of meditating. And you can design an experiment to see whether one is better than others.
The gomla du nangbegi gomna ke jesho na rig mangbu yorwas. Dila du ta rig minro yodu dila pa be ngaran sugi ani taje sue yorwas. Kom dila pa be kom rig mandro yodu dila pa be taje minro sue yorwas.
So the question is, how would you design that experiment to test different types of meditation?
Chezanta thanda thiwa di dili yores. Ta gomla du gomla rig minro mangbu yorwas. And di minro yodu dila pa be koran sui taje khari chitu res la jura. Taje khari chitu res lan di thiwa di is.
And how would you actually compare meditation or some of the other practices such as memorizing or making a sand mandala or debating?
Tanda di yo chi ra da gom ge da an thang shi khiran sugi ta se ta da Doeguling che da di chama di lo special lo ji che chama khande si yo chi gi best.
And thank him for that question for clarifying.
Ani khiran gi thiwa ta del thushen nas.
다 간다 신이 봄 바이나 이 런지 지야다 아까도 보면 이런 게 수준 샘플을 들어라 제가 가리했어요. 근데 다 신이
So was that the question? What's the difference between shamatha meditation? How can you differentiate between these, like memorization and all this?
How would you design the experiment?
Ali di marsha kya dinzo di taje chela ni di taje khande je tugi is taje khande je sugi is kherangoni. Taje khande che yi la ta thanda shine gom digi thanda yila chebe gi tuen di ya khombe tang dus la ra di la taje khande je tugi is.
아니 다소 신세 센스 지도네요. 아니 다 문제론지 도리나 다가가 나와 있어요. 저 센스 지도네 돈 제가나 아니 이다 아니 다 준비를 하고 있어요.
Di che chik du aina stunde di khar ragre.
센스 지도네 돈이 다 존지 제가나 다다 나와요. 가르쳐요. 네 제가나 이거 준비되라 다 그들라니 다
So na
पाई से मचे ने चिमो चिमो दे तानी करे ना दे बता जे जे दे बाई ना अनि या che बस रहते अनि टेम्बो दे तो दी
so ane tembu dire la re thiore. So when you put your attention and when you have a focused attention, your gom ge la re la mara che chik la ne oinas ani yila chebe tuindi ya khombe du restra. Okay, so when you are doing anything and like memorizing a text or anything, if you put your attention in that, so when you give focused attention, your attention span increases, or it progresses.
Sure. So, but what we're interested in doing is designing an experiment to test the specific effect of shamatha meditation versus all these other things that we do to improve our attention.
The race to nang chio na ani thanda yela chebe to indi yarge khombe du race la di the race in thanda chio di khari lo na shamatha thanda shine gom di nyamle chio na ta thanda yela chebe gi to indi yarge tang dus la go ra di ani shimba da duru na di yarge tang dus la ni ta shimba de zupi ni ra thanda di yela chebe shine rang di gom di nyamle chio na yarge tang dus la na di ta taje khande ji chitu race
아니 일라시비 뭐 얘기도하라 상황을 맞서니까 미파는 학교이지 않아. 미파야. 미사이기 미사상을 가서 미파 아니 학교이지 않아. 뒤도 별세 유틸 내거라. 뒤도 지내기가 바이나 지내세야 센트지 버려야
This struggle kranju samma thanda khandes china yarge ta yor di kejeremendu thanda di kharslana shine gom de nyamle chiwa inas ra ani thanda yela chebe tuendi tadi yarge dugu yor lasar di treasure di dugu yor esla dinga zo tagje chi chu rasta seri ko embe chani an tagje khande chigelo.
Okay, we'll take just 3 more.
Ta sum rang le das
단지 단지 있으면 하나는 공부하러 오시나 먼저 시작에 신이지 검정에 유검지는 세계에서
조금 나
나한테 유검지가 아니 다른 것은 담고 됐을 나한테 유검지에서 생각을 해보고 아니 생각을 요구하는 다른 데 다른 야구에서 다른 나무들 오신게지 오주먹을 사실 나랑 유검지 집에는 오주먹을 말하기 센데 아니 싫어도 맡고 와이나 아니 뭐 음악 가르치잖아. 아니 신이지 건데 아니 예배식 말이야 공부하러 와라 승체지 리바라 아니 이 공부요 이거 많이 지냈어.
kare ug di yama to ai di chiyo resra
니 보라 신이지 건지 봐라
ug di gal gum di resra
나도 그거 됐어. 나도 요가 되나 아니 맞아 배차를 지금들 하나 가르치잖아. 소소 오유 오야 신이지가 누가 되라 되니 다야 맞으니 아니 선대 싫어도 말하지 아니 용토도나 아니 되라 되니 뭐 받으라 되니 신이가 되니 아니 선 예배식 가서 공부해서 이제 저거
ta khare di ug yama ta ai jura digal chenong chitu na
이것이 봐라 아니 선나 요구래 아니 선나 요구는 맞아 던지 군대가 무슨 싫어도 누가 나하면 나를 셔라
ta di ma
강도시
ta mi khare lo chik rang la du ne thanda ma zo di ug yama yudong che jura di rang la tunang che ni chi la na ma yo ina ta di yila chebe tuen di yarge trotu res di re yarge di draw your res lan la tu res. Okay, so he said there's a prediction. He said like we focus mainly on breathing when we talk about shamatha meditation. So how long can you like focus your attention on the breathing without diverting your mind to other factors? So if you try to focus your attention on that, and if you are able to do so, we say that your attention span is improved or increased. So that's his prediction.
That's his prediction.
Yeah.
신의 뭐가 되겠다 일을 안에 라 제를 때려 안에 줄여 무슨 네 도와들라 안에 둘이 가리시 들어라 때려서 다시 와서 도와들는 거
Dilawata to dida tang sa re law re gi tang yor la sa ga tang yor res di ani tang yor me di tak che chusha khari
뭐 다시 시간을 오시고 있는 거 제가 tambo 머리가 막 tudawira 이게 뭐냐 뭐가지고 많이 버시라 뭐가지고 많이 버시
ko ma jeng chi
많이 버시 다 쉬어서 안에 뭐 쏘러 버지 안에 때려요 뭐 맞네 안에 뭐 쏘러 버지 뭐 가야 맞지 막 가만 하자라 돼 버시라
sum gom geng sawa che sum che ge yo ma res di da mitu ne gom gya de res
소유지다 집어치지 아니까
khuri chi pa
자지도 거예요. 다 담고 거기서 거기 좋아나 아니 저거만 주인지 다 마시는 거기 좋아하는 거네. 치마거리 됐다. 아니 다들 본적이 있더래요. 아니 고마라 이제 아니 다들 일을 시켜서 계속 무슨 세 그리신 거예요. 다 반도라고 들으시더라고요.
So he said that we can collect two groups of people, and one who will not practice meditation, and the one group of 3 persons. They carry on like they are new meditators, and they will keep on meditating for around 6 or 7 days, and we will see what are the differences between the minds of these two groups.
Okay, great. And we can measure in that situation. It's a very good idea. Meditating versus non-meditating, or meditate different types of meditation. And we can then give a test of attention span where we can actually collect data and measure it.
The rest, the rest can show na shirukani se chik di gom che nyamle ma che chik di gom nyamle che thang na shi misum sur lara gom mindra nyamle che an Quran so la so yila che be gi ta che go mangbu ju ra ta ni di ni chi ju che go de zo an Quran so gi thang do du ya ras.
We might also test the meditator versus the non-meditator in a situation where there are many distractions, loud noises, radios blaring, horns honking, dogs barking, to actually test how well they can focus their attention.
Dila do ani Quran so thunang khagas chi du lai jura di ta ja chi khari ju ni che la na tan gom ma yang yi da gom yang ri ni ga khamba chi na sha dina la ta shugen dam ne te ni khashi da shimbu dulu ndi chi da din de che ani temu ro te dam ne che na yang la mangbu shi te dina la ni zu ta ja che ras mi khangi gi ta thunang thanda yila che be gi thanda yuni gyuri wan ne thwe sui chi tu du di ta ja chi tu res.
So, but you can see that this is a very hard hypothesis to test because you have many different ideas about how you might test it, but to actually draw a strong conclusion, you want to design an experiment that controls for the length of meditation and what the person is doing.
Dila da thanda chusha di la shawainas and dila taje rol na thablam ro mangbu shu ji ni do as dila du gola and thanda dila du cha shawainas taje dina la jo taje ji su du gola chi di khari shayar la na chunjin gi ruha che chi taje ruha la ni su ros.
So in this example, you could design an experiment where you have two groups of monks, group A and group B.
Ta di taje na cha shawainas ra ruha ni res and ruha thangbo dina la ani ming A lan shayes ruha ni wa dila ruha B lan shayes.
In group A practices shamatha meditation every morning. They also practice debates and memorization.
Ta ruha thangbo jur A jur dina la kusho changma kharnang gur la na thanda shine gom jua di ani nyamlen chi res thana shi ne ta se ta ya che ani lunjin che di sama chi res.
Group B would sit but not meditate.
Ta ruha ni wa jura kunjo de kusho ba khoran zo khar chi gur la na de di res kom ge gur mares.
But they would also debate and memorize.
Ine khoran zo khari ur la na thanda ta se ta di tang gur res di ruha na kusho din so an thang na shi ani lunjin ya chi gur res.
And then we could test group A and compare their attention span to group B.
Ta di ruha ni ros onjo di ni penju dure ros khoran zo yila chebe tu ringa sula duslan di ni dure res ruha ni di.
Okay?
Seo cha selaste.
Thank you so much for all your ideas.
Ta samju na wa dilani thushe nas khin samala.
Let's turn to one last aspect of the scientific method I want to talk about.
Ta thanda cheri ge thablam yas dina le ne dun chik thamaru dil ha yus di por sheins.
And this is a review of how to read graphs. So when we collect data, we like to put the data into graphs.
Ta ma zo thangdo du ros ta che chini. An thangdo du ser jalo ma zo di tigri na ko ros.
So next slide. So in this case, we are going to compare bar graphs versus line graphs.
Ta tanda nganzo dina la ni tigri ni yores chi di ibri che chi tigri che yores.
So what is a graph?
Ta tigri la na khani chi lagi yores khari res.
A graph is a representation of information.
Ta tanda tigri la na khani chi lagi yor la na ni chu ra gyo jora di chunje ji cha de res.
Typically in a graph we're comparing two variables.
Dila du ta nganzo tigri na sha du gola mindo ni tu gyo ros.
And a graph allows us to look at the relationship between those variables.
Dila du tanda ne chu ni tu gyo ros tigri na di ni phar gi teo khari me di tigri na ku gyo res.
Most of the time when we graph data, we plot the data along two axes. So we refer to this is the y-axis and this is the x-axis.
Ta nganzo tigri ko du gola tigning thi yos di tanda chela thi jo dila x lagi res x axis lang ani shung la jo dila y axis lagi res.
And it allows us to look at the relationship between one variable we plot on the x-axis versus another variable we plot along the y-axis.
Ta tanda tigri na la chi call ko la na x la ku ras chi y la ku ras dini phar gi do khari me di tung gi res tigri na la ni su ni ra dini phar gi do de.
And one of the values of graphing data is it allows us to visualize, to actually see the relationship better.
Dilo du tigri ko na chi keben khari yor la na tanda dini gi phar le khebar khari me de mi gi khatu thoya lela chha tab de chha yor ras.
So in this example of average rainfall over months of the year, along the x-axis is plotted the month of the year, January, February, March, April, May.
Ta tanda di chawa khagas kya image ra logic na di tu res tigri na la. Ta tanda di x ji do thum chelo ni di dinal khari tu la na logic na la dawa khari chinda thangbo nyo sumba ra di chungyo res.
And along the y-axis, we're plotting average number of days of rainfall here.
Di y yo jo sta shung la yo dinal khari chungyo la wa na ima khagas chawa phag le jo ra di chungyo res.
Or we might plot along the y-axis the amount of rain that fell.
Theona jian thik thewa ji tang na digo res y chodela. Di khari yor la na chawa khagas kya me ngajo mangyung jora di te ros.
So let's begin just with the bar graph, which is showing the amount of rain, the precipitation. And you can see from this graph that there is a big difference in the amount of rain that falls in March compared to October, which has much more rain.
Ta da di thingri dinal ta wazam gi hagu dos dinal khebar dilam sa thongres dina ta wa na chinda sumba da chinda chuba ni ta wa na khebar shu dos chawa phabide.
If we compare the bar graph data to the data plotted here, which is the average number of days that it rains,
Ta da thingri dil ta ninga ju gi nima khabas chawa gya yemi di ta wa nas.
We can see that it rains many more days in the month of July and August, for example, than it does in November or April.
Ta nima khabas manga chawa phab shalai di dawan an ta wa nas and di thingri na ta wazam gi ani chinda dumba da chinda geba na manga chai dos chinda sumba da di chinda chukchi na dur wa nas.
So if you look at these data, in October, we have the most rain falling in the month of October, but it has fewer days of rain than, say, August.
Dila du thanda ngombo chi do di thiri digita chawa mangyung dir do di ani nima mangyung di seu di chungyo res ra dila du gala thanda manga khol phaber la na chinda chul chinda chukji na phab dos ina thanda chawa mangyung di chinda chukji na manga che ani nima mangyung ta wa na thanda chinda dumba de geba di manga chagi dos chukji da do wa nas.
So this is an excellent example of how we can compare different types of data in a graphical form, and then we might make predictions about if we know it rains more in October, but there are fewer days that it rains. My prediction is that on those few days that it does rain, it rains very, very hard.
Ta thanda di tigri la ta chamgi ta cha mangyung khagas kya me ani nima mangyung khagas kya me tyungyo roas an thanda di tigri na ta oina chinda chona cha mangbu shu gya res ine nima ta oina nima mangbu shu gya ma res ra di la du gala nima khashi ji gya shu ringala cha de shu chimbu shu gya wangi ngomba chitu roas.
Okay? Great, let's go to the last slide then. So in this case, we're looking at the temperature, the average temperature for the city of Hubli.
Ta thanda gyasa Hubli ji roas digi ani ta trizi jura chanyum ki trizi ro di te res tigri na.
In the orange, we're plotting the average high temperature.
Ta di liwang ji ten do thi liwang di khari chungyo la oina thanda trizi che yoge chanyum di te res sajedi.
And in blue, we're plotting the average low temperature.
Tila dugala chaje ma yuni jura di khari ki chungyo la oina thi ngombu di chungyo res.
And across the x-axis, it's the months of the year, January, February, March, April, May, etc.
Ta thanda x ji do the la yo dina la khari chungyo la oina thanda logic na daw chungi jinda thangbo nyo sumba digi res.
So when you look at these data, which month is the hottest month?
Ta di thangdo dile ta waina sra dawa khandi di chashu reshas. May and April
April. April is the hottest month.
chinda shio di chashu re dos tigri dilta di.
So just to conclude, I think we'll be using graphical representations of data throughout the lectures in the next week. And I want to make sure that you're all comfortable with looking at bar graphs and line graphs. Does anyone have any questions?
Dinda jema jura dina la dana wanzu thangdo chunjil khar phechi yore tigri pheju chi yor la ros di an tigri de tende ro mangbuch pheju chi res in khana zo pheje ta di seo cha yogi resa tigri ha ura lo da. Yes.
Okay. That ends today's afternoon activity, so thank you very much.
Ta thanda tuje di chawa insa. So you have next session or not?
No, this is
Okay, this is the last.
that's just the last one.
And di chare sa da di jela. So den shio yo maris.
Thank you.
Kushina.